All right, we are at Fort Dumont, outside of Verdun. This was one of the largest forts built during the 1880s and one of the largest forts in the area near the Meuse River. And basically it's a bunch of concrete structures sunken into a hill overlooking the entire region. Of course, now trees are grown back, but let's go ahead and take a look inside.
Now, after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, where a quick Prussian victory not only triggered the unification of German states to create the German Empire, the French government took a invasion from Germany again in the near future very seriously, and over the next 30 years invested heavily into building defensive lines, eventually constructing over 28 forts that formed a double ring around Verdun, consisting of observation posts, modern telegraph communications, large sleeping quarters, rotating turrets, and all the equipment you would need for modern warfare. And Dumont was just one of those forts. By the time the Great War comes around, these forts are largely obsolete and sitting targets for long-range artillery that can penetrate the thick walls, despite the fact that these forts were upgraded many times since the 1880s when they were built. What is more amazing about this particular fort is that the French understood this and stripped it of all heavy armaments and men, except for a small detachment of territorial French troops to defend it. Shortly after the main German advance, the 24th Brandenburg Infantry Regiment, after light resistance, made it to the back of the fort, slid down the ditch, and was able to enter it unopposed, where the small detachment of French soldiers defending it surrendered, promptly putting it into German hands. Now, what's pretty incredible about this fort is, after it being 100 years old, it is dripping water everywhere from being underground. Almost all of it was made of this limestone, and so stalagmites and stalactites are actually forming on the ceilings, on the surfaces. This is old telegraph wires right here with limestone after 100 years forming deposits on them, but the original structure is still pretty much all there, and it's pretty much open to the public.
You can just see the limestone because of all the water that's getting into the fort. And also the stalagmites on the top.
Now, this area of the fort is the blockhouse at the end, which houses a 155 millimeter gun turret, which is the heaviest of the four outward turrets, rotational turrets that the fortress actually had, and rotated on a pivot. But underground is where the mechanism and the crew that would operate it. So you haul the shells up, you rotate it on a motor. And when the French recaptured the fort in 1916, they found pretty much all of this still operational. And it hadn't been damaged after the 120,000 shells that had hit the fort over the last 2 years, which is pretty impressive. Here's the outward shell of the gun turret, the 155 millimeter gun turret that we were just looking at. Around it were other gun turrets for 75 millimeter guns. There was one for a Hotchkiss machine gun, and then it had a 360 pivot, so you could get a whole view of the surrounding valley. Of course, in 1916, this wouldn't have looked like a forest area. It would have been more like the surface of the moon.
So these are little sight holes. That was the main turret. And this right here was a much smaller turret. But as you can see, it can rotate. Let's see if we can't see these two main, and you can see where the gun would have been held. And they're just scattered all over the top of the fort, which can be accessed from the bottom, which is pretty interesting. Seeing all of these still, in place, and yeah, these are all crater holes here because for the time that the fort was under siege, there was just it was bombed. So this would have been more on the top would have been more undisturbed. So this is the remnants of one of the turrets, and as you can see, it was just completely bombarded and smashed with shells. Just like all this here, those are all bomb craters.
Now, on May 8th, 1916, an accident happened with some men of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment stationed inside the fort had allegedly attempted to light coffee with flamethrower fuel right next to a pile of artillery shells, but a fire broke out and immediately exploded the ordnance nearby. This triggered a massive chain reaction through the fort, exploding the thousands of shells, grenades, and other ordnance inside the fort, killing about 700 men instantly and injured roughly another 1,800. As blackened men covered in soot left the inferno, they were mistaken for French colonial soldiers and were shot at by their own soldiers. And this was a massive, massive loss to the Germans. Now, despite this, the fort was continuously held by the Germans until a French offensive on October 24th, 1916 was able to retake it. Two 400mm howitzer cannons called Alsace and Lorraine bombarded the fort, causing fires and smoke to ripple throughout the inside. The Germans that were inside the fort began burning their intelligence papers, maps, other sensitive material before finally surrendering to a regiment of French Moroccan troops that were part of the offensive to retake the fort. About over 8 months of battle over the fort, millions of shells were fired, turning the surrounding countryside into a basic moonscape and cost the lives of tens of thousands of men. Outside of the fort is, or was, the village of Fleury-devant-Douaumont, once a small commune of 422 villagers that were going about their lives as people trying to make a living in rural France, suddenly became the center of one of the largest battles of the Great War. Quickly evacuated within the thousands of other civilians in the area, the village was literally and utterly destroyed over the 8 months of battle. All that remain today are placards and arrows of where houses, streets, and churches once stood.
All these little pits were where there used to be some sort of house or establishment. Farm. I think they said there was a population of about 400 in this village of Dumont, right near the Verdun Memorial Museum. And then Fort Dumont is right down that road. But there's a nice little memorial they have for the villagers that were evacuated and came back and after the war, and there was nothing here but a few smokestacks. And you can see these large, craters everywhere. It's the landscape of the entire place is pretty unaltered.